From the Ear to There Travel Studio, this is the Ear to There Disney Podcast.
The Ear to There Podcast, it's time to start the show. Be sure to hold on tight, here we go. Exploring all the different Disney destinations. Ear to There, it's time to start the fun.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ear to There Disney Podcast, Walt Disney World Word of the Week. I am your host, Phil Gramlich. I am also the owner and the founder of Ear to There Travel, which is a Disney specialized travel agency. So now every other week, I will be bringing you a different Walt Disney World word, and then I'll give you background, history, fun facts, thoughts, ideas. I forget how I used to do this. All kinds of stuff about that word. Now, this week's word of the week is going to be a little bit different. Recently, I had the chance to talk to Disney legend and Imagineer Bob Gurr, who you hear on every numbered episode of my podcast. So, 120, 119, 118, he was there. But we started talking about an attraction from the 1964-1965 New York World's Fair, and that was the Ford Magic Skyway. Now, I asked around to some of my Disney obsessed friends, they're not as obsessed as I am, but they're pretty obsessed. And a few of them had never heard of the Ford Magic Skyway. So what it was, that's a lot of wases, I just realized, but it was, oh man, now I'm thinking about the Wuzzles. Remember the Wuzzles and the theme song? We're the Wuzzles, ooh yeah, we're the Wuzzles. All right. Anyway, but what it was one of the 4 Disney-designed attractions that went into the World's Fair, alongside It's a Small World, Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, and Walt Disney's Carousel of Progress. But it was the one attraction that never made its way back to Disneyland after the fair had ended. And just to give you a little bit of background on it before I bring Bob on this attraction, you would sit in full-size cars like a Ford Mustang or a Lincoln, and you were kind of towed through the attraction that way. So I found this story by Bob to be so kind of compelling, and I've never heard it, and I'm a complete Disney-obsessed, geek, we can say. So I thought you would really enjoy hearing it as well. So rather than tell it in my voice, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who will handle the word of the week this week and tell you all about the Ford Magic Skyway.
Well, here's another interesting thing. Disney had relations with 2 companies in Detroit in those later years. We obviously had relations with the Ford Motor Company for the New York World's Fair. And then later we had relations with General Motors, trying to get them to be the first sponsor in Epcot. So it was very curious. I actually spent more years of working with 2 companies in Detroit than I ever spent actually living there. So it was a very interesting relationship. Now, with respect to the details of this question to do with the Ford Magic Skyway, obviously, Walt Disney was having one-on-one meetings with Henry Ford II and other personnel at the Ford Motor Company while they were trying to figure out what would they do at the New York World's Fair, and they felt that they should hire the Disney company, who looked like they would be able to do a job like that. And Ford was quite confident that they would do as much as they could do as far as the overall design of the idea for this attraction. And then Walt had entirely different ideas about how you should do this. And so they discussed the fact that in 1940 World's Fair, Ford Motor Company had, Ford and Lincoln and Mercury cars that drivers would drive the guests around in this little track. So that was in the forefront of Henry Ford's thinking that we should make sure our guests have see and touch and enjoy Ford Motor Company cars. And they said, well, it's too expensive to have drivers try to do that. And Walt says, well, we'll simply was simply have an automatic conveying system, and where the Ford vehicles will go through a show that we will design, and as simple as that. And then when I believe Henry Ford asked Walt Disney, well, how would you do that? And Walt said, oh, well, we have the Matterhorn track with these little booster brakes with little wheels in the track, and it works very well. And then there was a Ford unnamed vice president who was objecting to all of this. And when it came time to proceed with the Disney company or not proceed, Henry Ford said, well, we're going to do it. And then this guy started to object. And it was very obvious to Walt. We gave him a big chuckle. Henry Ford, under the table, reached over and kicked that manager in the shin so bad that the man in mid-sentence stopped and approved the agreement.
Wow.
So that meant that meeting, Walt left that meeting with an agreement that Disney will proceed, and that whatever the way this show's going to be and whatever this track is going to be, it's going to have Matterhorn booster brake tires. That was a technical decision made quickly in a meeting by non-technical people. So Walt comes back and asked me to take a look at this agreement that he just made, and this was right about the end of June of 61, and said, I want you to get started on moving Ford Motor Company convertibles in a show that we're going to design, and whatever you do, you're going to use little wheels in the track, because that's what I told him.
Nice.
So here it's very funny. Rather than giving me a chance to figure out, what should we do? Well, it had already been decided what we're going to do, and the ball was thrown at me. Now, go figure this thing out. I've already promised them. So that's how we got started.
Was that? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, in actuality, it wasn't very mysterious. It was a case of, okay, yeah, we can take Ford cars and we can put a flat panel on the bottom, which I call a platen. And much like the bottom of the people mover cars, has a flat bottom, which we call a platen. I said, okay, well, we'll just put platens on Fords and Mercurys and Lincolns and Comets and Falcons and all those kinds of cars. And then we'll put a bunch of wheels in the track that have electric motors, and then we'll have some kind of electrical system and control system do it. So it's just a bunch of elements that you start figuring it out. And I had enough of it figured out in about, maybe a week and a half or so, and I called one of the electric companies and immediately started talking to a salesman so I could see what kind of motors do we need, all that kind of stuff. So right away, we involved some vendors, so I know what kind of equipment we can get. And then it wasn't very long after that. In fact, I believe it was right around probably the 10th of July of 61. My boss, Roger Brogy Sr., and myself flew to Detroit and started a series of meetings during the course of a few days to have further descriptions of what are we going to do, because they were looking at the fact that they are in the automobile business. They have conveyors and for assembly lines, and they will be in charge of the technical design and manufacture of the Ford Magic Skyway. And Roger and I said, well, no, Walt Disney told us that I'm going to do it. So we had a war started immediately, because some of the comments got rather heated, in which basically one of the Ford chief engineers to do with their design of their assembly lines said, no, we're not going to allow some Mickey Mouse outfit out in movie land to tell us how we're going to move our cars.
Wow.
All right, okay, you want to play like that, all right. So I proceeded with enough of the design that we showed exactly how it would work, how the track would work, how the steering would work, how the planting would work, and all that. And in the meantime, the Ford's plant engineering department, with this somewhat obstinate engineer, he had his guys drawing up a conveyor system. So while both of us were working in parallel, Ford made other agreements to have me fly back there and go to some of their assembly lines. Particularly, there was a nice one, Lincoln assembly line over in Novi, Michigan. And of course, they wanted to show me their expertise. They show how it all works. They said, well, here's some of our manufacturers that manufacture all this equipment. Why don't you talk to them? Which I did. I got all their information. And then I think within a couple of weeks, we were going to have a major design review back in Detroit again. And in a corporate headquarters of the Ford Motor Company, which was a glass building, which was referred to as Panic Palace. There was always, angry meetings in a way, which were kind of funny. But it turned out that the Ford Plant Engineering showed this proposal to kind of a committee of people between Disney and Ford. And the thing was a relatively hopeless thing because it was all done with a bunch of drive shafts and all kind. It was a cumbersome piece of junk. But it's typical of what an assembly line guy would see. And ours was typical of what would we do since we know how to make a Matterhorn work, which was a design that came out of aero development with the booster brake idea, which Walt told Henry Ford, well, that's how we're going to do it. So that was a major meeting, and I got a big chuckle out of the whole thing because all of a sudden these fancy opinionated Ford production engineering group all had a bunch of egg on their face when we showed them why their system won't work. And while they were trying to show me why my system won't work, so we flew back to California and never heard another word from Ford. We just proceeded. So we worked on that, and then we did a test track. Only a few months later, in November, about 16th of November, 61, we did a test track at the Disney studio. That worked. Then we added more to it the following spring. And then hopping ahead to the future, I think it was the last week of 1963, we were going to do the first test in the actual Ford pavilion, which had now been completed. The track was complete. We were starting to load up cars. And the funniest thing happened. We got enough cars on one track so that we could start to do some tests. So I was in a spot where I could watch the cars, and then the guys started the ride up, and all the cars started moving. And then about 3 minutes later, they stopped. And I heard all this screaming and yelling throughout the building. And I thought, oh, my gosh, what on earth happened? And then Roger grabbed me and he says, come on, we're going over the hotel next door. We're going to have a party. Well, it turned out there was a gigantic party with a lot of booze and hors d'oeuvres and everything. The screaming was the Ford Motor guys. There was a whole bunch of them there by that time. They were screaming in relief that the thing worked because they did not believe our system would ever work.
Oh, wow.
And can you imagine going to a meeting in which everybody got so drunk by being relieved that their neck was not in the noose for going along with a crazy Mickey Mouse Disney guy moving their cars? And it was a surprise to me because I thought, well, of course it works. I mean, obviously, but not to them.
Wow.
I never forgot that drunken party.
That's a great story, Bob. Thank you for that. I never heard about the drunken party after the test of the Magic Skyway. That's really cool.
Well, just before we started to run the track, we were moving the convertibles up an elevator from the lower part of the building up into the track. It was kind of a tedious thing. You had to take these cars up one at a time. And we only had one elevator, which was done by a low bid company, Montgomery Elevator Company. And while I was looking at the elevator, we had a red Mercury convertible came up there. And as they were attempting to offload it onto the floor, the car was partway on the floor and partway in the elevator. And all of a sudden, the elevator started to go down by itself. Something broke. And visualize this elevator is going down slowly, maybe like a foot a minute, and it's slowly crushing the mercury.
Oh, man.
And in the building. And slowly you could hear this crashing and banging and glass breaking, a windshield broke. And then pretty soon we had the tail end of the car up on the floor and the rest of the car in the elevator stuck halfway down to the next floor. We were out of business. We can't put any more cars in the building until we chop up and cut that car out and then put another elevator in there.
Oh, man.
So nobody was in a good mood.
I guess not.
So years later, there was always the joke when we talked, we'd meet the Ford guys again. They says, "Oh, man, hey, do you remember the red Mercury halfway down the elevator?" Crunching and crashing. Oh, boy.
That's awesome.
There's all this stuff that goes on that nobody ever knows about.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I never heard that story before. Who would know unless you were there? So why do you have any idea why the Magic Skyway wasn't moved to Disneyland like the other three attractions that were there at the World's Fair?
Oh, no, that would have been a very cumbersome thing to do because, the fair was a 2-year fair, where most fairs are a 1-year fair. But you got to also remember the 4 attractions that we did, the agreement with each one of those companies was that the showbiz aspects, like dinosaurs and robotic figures, some of the show aspect things, the agreement was that they would build and operate this stuff. And at the end, as they would demolish the attractions, we would take our stuff that they paid for and we bring it back and put it in Disneyland. Well, it was so smart that way. We got a whole bunch of stuff for Disneyland that we never paid for. So out of the Ford Motor Company, we had remember those dinosaurs? And we brought them to Disneyland and they still live at Disneyland on the railroad track. So there's no point trying to take apart a building that has a track that has all these motors and the cars. Now, here's the funny part. When I was first developing the car system, I had to start with a Lincoln first, which is the heaviest car, which was a little over 4,000 pounds. And I had to take everything out and get as light as possible. And I got it down to 1,900 pounds from a little over 4,000 pounds. And the car looked the same, but everything came out that you couldn't see. And then so the agreement was we were the heavier cars, we would have to take the engines and the drivetrain, everything out of it. And we would do the same to the smaller cars based upon the Falcon platform. Well, Ford Motor Company, they didn't want to pay to strip the lighter weight cars because I convinced them, and it would still work. They're heavier than I want, but they would work. Because Ford wanted to use the cars for 2 years and then clean them up and sell them again.
Oh, wow.
They had a company in nearby that would put the platens on and weld certain things in the bottom of the car. With we had a little generator in the back and stuff like that. And then they would put the gas tanks back in, put the exhaust pipes and everything back on it, and then clean them up and resell it. And so they had this company doing that job. So it was the craziest darn thing that we had these ride vehicles that we couldn't have moved them to Disneyland anyway because they were used cars. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do with that? So it was the craziest thing. Now hop ahead a whole bunch of years. In fact, about 5 years ago, the local Mustang club here in the San Fernando Valley had me come out and do a presentation to them. And I learned that at least one of those Mustangs that was on the Ford Motor Company ride actually was sold and was used as a used car and had been found in Georgia in a junkyard. And a guy said, yeah, this came from the Magic Skyway. Well, how do you know that? And he says, well, I'll send you photographs of the bottom of the car. I have the photographs of the bottom of this Mustang and all the stuff that we welded to the car. They never did cut off when they sold this car.
It was still there.
Somebody drove that car for like 30 years, not knowing all this welded junk in the bottom of the car had nothing to do with the car.
Oh, man. Well, wouldn't a mechanic have picked up on that over the years?
Well, it's crazy. I mean, there's this whole Ford Magic Skyway has so much crazy history to it. Every once in a while, somebody sends me more information or copies of contracts with different suppliers that were doing the modifications, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I suppose I should gather everything up to do with the ongoing history of the Ford Magic Skyway. Even the Ford Times magazine, they did a big article on it not too many years ago. So, yeah, this lady that asked this question about Ford, yeah, you got a lot of answers.
Yeah, I can make a whole podcast episode out of the answer, actually. And that is exactly what I did. That answer was so good that it deserved its own episode. So thank you to Bob for being the star of the Word of the Week this week. And thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. And I hope you enjoyed Bob's story as much as I did. It's so cool to hear these stories from the person who lived them. I mean, Bob's in a meeting with Walt Disney and Henry Ford, and it's amazing. So I wanted to bring this to you, and I wanted you to hear it. So thank you so much for listening. Just remember, there will be a new episode of the Ear to There Disney podcast each and every Monday, as well as a new episode of the Word of the Week, or It's a Food World each and every Wednesday. Until next time, thank you again so much for listening. Have yourself just an amazing week. Bye-bye.